Hello and welcome everyone to this joint SCAR and COMNAP panel discussion on the impact of COVID-19 on Antarctic research. I'm Chandrika Nath, Executive Director of SCAR, and it's really great to see so many of you here. The impact of COVID-19 has come up in many of our discussions this week, with frequent references to the need to find a new normal. We've heard throughout the week's presentations about the importance of the Antarctic in answering vital questions about the fate of our planet and the importance of continued observational data. As national Antarctic programs begin to make decisions and implement plans for the upcoming season, these plans by necessity include restrictions and provisions to reduce risk. In this session, we're going to discuss what the impacts of COVID-19 might be on our ability to carry out research in and around Antarctica over the coming years, and the implications for the diverse communities involved. We've just heard a fascinating presentation from Dr. Daniela Legat with reflections on opportunities as well as risks to consider into the future. We're now going to bring in a group of panelists who can provide their own and their organization's unique perspectives on the subject. And hopefully we can come out of this discussion with some practical ideas on ways forward and tease out those glimmers of hope that Daniela referred to in her talk. So let me tell you briefly who our four panelists are, first of all. So first up, we have Dr. Kelly Faulkner, who's Director of the Office of Polar Programs of the US National Science Foundation and is Chair of COMNAP, or the Council of Managers of National Antarctic Programs. Kelly's Director of the US Antarctic Program, which NSF manages on behalf of all the US government. Professor Gary Wilson is Chief Scientist at GNS Science in New Zealand and also Professor in Marine Science and Geology at Otago University. He's also spent time as Chief Science Advisor for Antarctica New Zealand and as a Director of the New Zealand Antarctic Research Institute. Gary's currently Vice President of SCAR and is Chair of the New Zealand Royal Society Te Aparangi Committee on Antarctic Sciences. Dr. Hannah Nielsen is a lecturer in Antarctic law and governance at the University of Tasmania. Hannah is a past president of the Association of Polar Early Career Scientists, or APEX. She currently serves on the Executive Committee of the SCAR Standing Committee on Humanities and Social Sciences and the SCAR Capacity Building, Education and Outreach Committee. And finally, for those of you who didn't hear the talk she just gave, Dr. Daniela Legat is a social scientist with a background in environmental management, Antarctic politics and tourism research based at Gateway Antarctica, University of Canterbury in New Zealand. Daniela is a Chief Officer of SCAR's Standing Committee on the Humanities and Social Sciences and a member of both SCAR's Standing Committee on the Antarctic Treaty System and its Capacity Building, Education and Training Committee. And finally, Gabriella Rowland from the University of Canterbury is moderating and keeping time. So thank you, Gabriella. Each of our panelists is now going to have 5 minutes to outline how the pandemic has affected the way they and their organizations work and highlight their key priorities for the future. Because these talks are short, we'll run through all the panelists and then we'll take questions at the end. Before we begin, I'll remind you, the audience, again, to put your questions at any time into the live question and answer box on the right. And if your question's for a specific panelist, then please mention their name in the question so we know who to direct it to. So on that note, I'd like to invite Dr. Kelly Faulkner to speak. Thank you, Kelly.
Hello, and I say hello to everybody out there. I'll be wearing my COMNAP hat today, and my presentation is to represent more broadly the COMNAP community. So National Antarctic Programs have been planning for future Antarctic research seasons years in advance, normally, and program managers are intimately familiar with risks inherent to Antarctic activities. So we're constantly working to address and reduce risk, often in consultation with other program managers. And in any given year, operational plans are usually developed with contingencies in mind and redundancies built into the system. So even as the COVID-19 situation began to emerge and evolve, we were on it. National Antarctic programs were quickly aware that the risks the global pandemic would pose to transiting Antarctic expeditioners and to any winter over persons if COVID-19 were introduced to the Antarctic population at a station or at a regional level. So we began immediately to consult with our Antarctic medical community and other health authorities to discuss strategies to prevent the intercontinental transfer of COVID-19 to Antarctica. So we also declared very early on a common goal, and that was simply prevent the spread of COVID-19 to the Antarctic Treaty Area. So understanding the risk related to Antarctic operations in the context of a global pandemic and taking action to mitigate or eliminate those risks has equated to the level of activity in Antarctica having to be dialed back for at least the upcoming season. And I'm sure you're all well aware of that. Reducing activity to zero for the upcoming season is generally not an option for those programs who currently have winter over expeditioners at year-round Antarctic stations. The mental and physical well-being of these expeditioners must be considered, and there's a high priority to carry out exchange of personnel from these facilities as per original timelines, or as close to the timelines as is reasonably possible. So national Antarctic programs did not make the decision to reduce activity lightly, and most realize that acting decisively now to keep Antarctic stations operational is essential or research could be impacted long into the future. And we recognize, and Chandra and Stephen Chown, Michelle Rogan-Finnemore, Executive Secretary of COMNAP, and I had a wonderful conversation in trying to plan for this particular panel about the need to be in this together. This is a huge problem and we need to be working together for it. We understand there's unease in the research community. Many projects are long-term or duration more than a single season or a year and receive agreed funding to reach milestones. And those things have been interrupted. So we realize we need to be engaging the community in a series of conversations. It's going to need to be ongoing, including this panel discussion. And there appear to be two primary concerns: the impact a reduced Antarctic season might have to long-term research, and then changes to national Antarctic programs planned for entire seasons arguably affect early career persons the most. So with respect to that, and out of the discussions SCAR and COMNAP leadership have had, COMNAP's already completed an initial project to identify all long-term science projects across all 30 COMNAP member programs. And we're looking at new ways to support early career persons. So we expect to engage with APEX to help move us forward in that effort. The national Antarctic programs understand the value of their Antarctic infrastructure, movable assets such as aircraft and research vessels, and equipment related to research, communications, and environmental management in Antarctica. So I'd like to remind the Antarctic community of the work SCAR and COMNAP already done on the Horizon Scan and the Antarctic Roadmap Challenges project. That's critical. So we don't need to reinvent that wheel in the context of COVID-19, but we are adding to the outcomes that we reached in these two future-looking community projects. So national Antarctic programs recognize the need to be prepared and to act quickly in the context of addressing the risk from COVID-19 to Antarctic personnel and operations. And the national Antarctic program alone cannot be solely responsible for keeping Antarctica COVID free. We have to work together. This is a shared responsibility to keep everybody safe, and especially to ensure we're in a position to continue to collect globally important data from Antarctica. And I do know that programs have placed a high priority on sustaining those critical long-term observations, and any science infrastructure or activities that would do irreversible damage to our ability to continue to carry out the highest quality science in Antarctica. And with that, I'll complete my remarks.
Thank you, Kelly. And now we'll move directly to Gary Wilson.
Thank you, Chandy, and thank you, Kelly, and others. And yeah, thanks for the efforts COMNAP are working with SCAR on. It's really very much appreciated. And we know it's a moving challenge as we all work this out, and we look forward to keeping those efforts up. But Just let me first acknowledge the extreme disruption that we all face from COVID-19. There's nothing normal about the way we're having to rethink how we operate and how we keep people safe and how we strive to eliminate the pandemic and its threat to human life. I also want to acknowledge the sacrifices and incredible effort that we're all making to achieve a collective solution here. We definitely have to work hard to keep COVID-19 out of Antarctica. As you all know, SCAR is tasked with the development and coordination of Antarctic and related Southern Ocean research and the role of the Antarctic region in global systems. SCAR also provides scientific advice to the Antarctic Treaty members through the Antarctic Treaty System and other mechanisms. And now the COVID-19 pandemic has made things very challenging for our researchers. And as you'll have heard in Daniela Liggett's plenary this morning, we're working with SCAR researchers to understand the challenges that they face and how we might help. So that's very important work for SCAR. The international coordination and collaboration that SCAR undertakes is also very difficult to maintain. Presently, we achieve most of this through international meetings, workshops, and through decision-making at delegates meetings. So I just want to acknowledge, or at least let you know, we're working very hard to bring our activities online, which is very new for SCAR. SCAR's current rules and procedures require many of our activities to happen in person, and much of our decision-making happens through discussions and consensus, and that's another difficult thing to achieve online. So, you know, the online discussions are a reasonable substitute for those who already know each other, but they really make things difficult for members of our community where English is not their first language. Also makes it difficult for early career researchers, as you've heard.
3 minutes.
As you've heard. So I'd just like to comment on what we might do despite the challenges. And as Kelly's mentioned, we do want to try and maintain the long-term monitoring efforts so we don't lose that continuity in these important records. We must also work out how to set up ourselves and our research programs to accelerate our fieldwork program and our research once things allow. So SCAR is encouraging its researchers to focus on existing data sets, that was already mentioned, and collections, and maximise the return on those to inform future research programs. As Valerie Masson-Delmotte highlighted in the opening plenary, IPCC is dependent on researchers getting their findings published in a timely manner, especially from Antarctic research, and especially due to these issues around changing global climate and loss of biodiversity, where these things are going to be still more difficult when we come out of the pandemic. So SCAR is very much encouraging our researchers to use this enforced break in gathering new data to accelerate the publications of findings. That's really important. I think that's a real opportunity here because we can do that and we can make sure we maintain impact. So while the disruption is challenging, let's not let it be limiting. Let's do our best to prevent it from distracting us from making sure we do our best to clearly articulate the role that Antarctica plays as the globe warms and ensuring that our actions and policy development account for those impacts. We can't let that ball drop through this pandemic. Even though I understand the pandemic and SCAR understands the pandemic's challenging to manage, we want to keep those things front of mind. Thanks, Chandy.
Thank you very much, Gary. And now we'll hear from Hannah Nielsen.
Yeah, thanks for that. So I'm Hannah Nielsen, speaking to early career researchers and their experiences. And I would say APEX, the Association of Polar Early Career Scientists, has actually been doing a lot of work remotely over the course of that whole organisation. In some ways, us APEX members feel like everything we've been doing has been building up to 2020 in terms of online conferences with those international teams. So we do actually have a lot of experience in that area, and there are opportunities for leadership for some of those early career researchers in sort of that transition to a digital land. And we've seen that with some of the helpers for this conference too, with SCAR 2020. But this pandemic, it does amplify many existing inequalities as we've heard from Daniela in the plenary just earlier, has disproportionately large effects, for instance, on working parents. Several papers published on that already. So there really is an important need for a focus on inclusivity, thinking not only about gender there as well, but sort of intersectionality too, and ability, really important to be thinking of, being inclusive of all abilities, and remembering that, first of all, scientists are people too. The ones doing this work are human beings. Postponement of fieldwork does have a really big impact on the development of those research projects and therefore the future careers, particularly of masters and PhD students. In many cases, the implications of delayed or cancelled field seasons can be greater than for those with established research careers who may also have existing data sets to call upon at this time. So that's something that we can look at too, the availability of that data. You need that data to write up your project. So making sure we have mechanisms in place to share that too, particularly with those who now won't be able to do their own fieldwork at this time. We have some issues around funding as well. Fellowships, for instance, are often tried to travel funding. And in this day and age, that's not something that's necessarily realistic. So it's useful to find ways to encourage new collaborations that don't necessarily involve physical travel. If we keep a focus on an aim on capacity building and sort of building up those skills and the connections between researchers and institutions, I think that's going to be really useful to keep in the front of mind. Also practically, something useful for early career researchers is even small funding opportunities for PhD extensions or seed fundings for new projects, so that early career researchers can have that experience as the lead in a research project too. And we know that a lot of the financial austerity at higher education institutions, as well as across the board national Antarctic programs and the like, is likely to make access to funding and then availability of jobs as well much more difficult in that short to medium term. So making use of those networks and helping to connect those early career researchers, and if you are established, actively seeking ways to create opportunities for them is very much appreciated, and one way to help us sort of avoid losing a whole generation of polar researchers over the coming years. In terms of organisation too, APEX is a volunteer organisation. COVID's had a really big impact on that and on the ability to undertake any work with all the life stresses, and also unequal access to technology has meant fewer people have been able to volunteer. So that makes fewer things possible. So that's another impact we could be thinking about too with this virus, also reducing the bandwidth that people have available to put towards different projects as well. And that has flow-on effects too. So those who do have that bandwidth to volunteer and can afford to do so are more likely to be able to build on that experience and leverage it in future in the jobs market too. So just again, thinking about that equity. So we do have some opportunities as well, and I'm sure we can discuss what are some of the positive things that could come out of these kind of discussions, but some of those established researchers making sure to advocate on behalf of precarious and early career researchers or their students to actively create opportunities or help build those networks. Rethinking accessibility in general. Part of that's making use of remote technologies while recognising the limitations, such as unequal access to internet access around the world, and also wider sharing of those existing data sets too. So if you've got just derailed research projects or a loss of fieldwork component, that can be something that can be reframed, and having these different organisations and researchers working together to do that. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Hannah. So now we're going to move to Daniela. And Daniela, I'm not going to ask you to repeat your presentation again, but I think if you like, do give us some reflections on what you've heard and respond to those. So Daniela, thank you.
Thank you, Shandy, and thank you to all the excellent contributions by the three other panelists, which I tried to making note of in order to reflect on those. As indeed, as Shandy said before, I do not want to repeat what I've already said within the last 40 minutes or so. What we've heard from the three other panelists is that in some way, COVID-19 is uniting us in that we are all facing one key challenge as well as one key goal. And that key goal of keeping Antarctica COVID-free that Kelly reminded us of is not only important for our community of SCAR researchers or even for the COMNAP members. It is also important for any player that engages with Antarctica and visits Antarctica. And here, the importance of working together cannot be underestimated. So we need to find a way of building and strengthening connections between the different stakeholders that are engaging with Antarctica and that are visiting the continent. And this includes the tourism industry. It also includes fisheries. And COVID-19 has reminded us to really rethink how we engage and how we ensure that our goals and priorities align, and that the strategies that we employ ensure that we can learn from each other and share lessons learned. We've also heard that different researchers and different organizations are affected in different ways by the pandemic. We've heard already calls for greater inclusivity and a shift in how we award funding and who to and why, and a shift away from travel funding towards other recognition of activities and research through bursaries and fellowships that does not necessarily relate or rely on the movement of people. We've heard of the difficulties in decision-making procedures and administrative structures that COVID-19 has brought along, and have learned the hard way that we have to rely more and more on remote work. And we know here that our early career researcher colleagues and the digital generation are miles ahead of where some of the rest of us are. So we need to learn from them. We also heard that capacity building is important, and that networking in these days relies on those remote linkages. While humans are still social animals relying on physical contact and suffering from not being able to have this physical or closer social contact, as we have seen in a number of papers that emphasize post-traumatic stress disorder being brought along by lockdowns, for instance. We also know that we have the opportunity here to learn from the long experiences of Antarctic support staff and researchers who are experienced in dealing with isolation and have some strategies at hand that they can share with the rest of the world. And finally, COVID-19 has reminded us of the role of science in society. And it might be a good opportunity to improve the science policy engagement and broader engagement between stakeholders in the Antarctic context as well. So here we really need to rethink how we engage in the future. And we need to find different ways of building on this collaboration, of ensuring that our collective decision-making is not threatened and is even enhanced in the future, that we come out stronger and that we respond not only retrospectively, but plan proactively. So thank you. I'll leave it at that.
Great, thank you everybody for those fascinating and very succinct responses. So we've got a lot of questions coming in already. To help us decipher the questions, can I remind the audience that you can click on the thumbs up next to the question, and that will push them up and down the list. So I'm going to be very democratic and pick the questions that get the most votes. So the first question, the most popular question at the moment, is something which is quite general, which I think I'd like to hear briefly from all the panelists on. A very important point that's come up throughout this conversation. What is the role of international collaboration in supporting researchers and research through the current crisis? So everybody has reflected on that. Kelly, you particularly said that national programs alone couldn't get through this crisis. So would you like to start?
Well, certainly. There are many internationally collaborative projects that are having to be delayed right now, but with full intent that we reprise them at earliest opportunity for the most part. So I think, it's weathering the current delays that is the challenge in front of us. And it's absolutely the case that we expect to continue the long and robust history of collaborations. So we've had regional breakout groups over the last few days for the COMNAP meeting, and there have been discussions among those groups of things that they do together that span from operational details to, full up intellectually matched contributions to collaborative science. So I don't think that COVID in the long run is going to negatively impact that. In fact, I think we are taking Hannah's words, which I think are wise ones, that the younger people were early adopters of technology. We have found ourselves in COMNAP wholeheartedly adopting technology that's going to improve our ability to do that kind of collaborative planning in the future.
Thank you. That's great. So Gary, would you like to comment from the perspective of SCAR and your own research?
Thanks, Jandy. Yeah, so this is a really interesting one. And my observations of SCAR are that SCAR is already a network-based organisation, and it's really about pulling people together anyway for everything it does around Antarctica. So in some ways, this is one of the things that SCAR is quite well placed to help folks with. And we've seen already continued development of the new scientific research programs for SCAR and different opportunities for people to connect and think about, okay, now is time to rethink how we do things, and it's time to work out how we can actually coordinate and work together. And that's happening reasonably well online, acknowledging what Hannah already said, which is that there are folks who are disadvantaged by that process. But the SCAR network's still there, it's operating, and already our scientists are pretty good at talking to and supporting each other in what they're trying to do. So compared to other organisations I'm involved in where you feel quite lonely and on your own in this, the SCAR community, I think, is a bit better off than that.
Thank you. And Hannah, would you like to come in there? Because I know APEX has, I'm not sure exactly how many member countries, but international collaboration is something that goes to the very heart of your organisation. And you already mentioned that you were not as technology that you weren't as dependent on physical meetings as perhaps other groups.
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, APEX at the moment has members in 73 countries and over 3,500 members and 28 national committees. So it really is sort of a global organisation there. I guess the idea there is the borders might be shut around the world at the moment, but our minds don't need to be. Our minds can very much still be open. Expertise is often not co-located anyway, and it's useful to talk to complement each other's work. But that collaboration between different organisations is also really important too, for ensuring that those ECRs are being considered. In terms of that idea of technology too, I do think it's useful to have realistic expectations though as well, not just sort of plonking things online and thinking that will be enough, but also thinking through what medium is best, what am I trying to achieve here, what sort of communication, synchronous, asynchronous, and where a mix of mediums might be useful too. And that's something to consider going forward as well. But working together, not just between researchers, between those organisations, and in many cases doesn't matter particularly where in the world you're based.
Thank you. And that's certainly something we're seeing with this meeting. We had over 2,000 people registered for this meeting, and that is over double the number of people that would normally register for an OSC. So it just shows that online interactions draw in vast numbers. So I think, Kelly, are you waving? I'm going to go to Daniela next, and then
Yeah, I just did one more comment to make.
I think Daniela's waving. Daniela's waving as well, so we'll have Daniela first, and then move to you, if that's all right.
Okay, thank you. I was just about to say Kelly can go first, but I actually don't have that much to add to what the three of you have already so nicely highlighted. But I think what we are also seeing is that people are getting much more adept at using online technology to just have impromptu meetings. All of us have suddenly had this flurry of Zoom meetings or using other technology that brought us together with researchers who we otherwise might only see once or twice a year in person. So we've actually had much more personal interaction despite being physically distanced. And this might help especially those researchers who are otherwise in very remote environments and may not have other people to really talk to about their research. And we have seen that a lot of early career researchers, certainly within the Standing Committee on the Humanities and Social Sciences, have used this technology to enter networks that were already sometimes in existence or new networks being formed, and brought them closer to being integrated in this community. And it also encouraged them to talk to a number of people who they may not have approached in person at a conference because of the factor of, oh no, this is a well-known researcher. It is too daunting to just step up to them and talk to them. And sometimes having technology available that also allows you to not share a video provides a bit more confidence to people who might otherwise feel isolated or daunted by talking to certain researchers.
Thank you. And before we move up to you, Kelly, I'm going to throw in another question which has moved to the top of the list. And it's, how can we use the learning from COVID-19 to build a more sustainable future with lower emissions? That's something that's come up throughout the meeting, the need to find a new normal. And Nick Gollidge said yesterday, the trauma of the pandemic has given us an opportunity to reset ways of living that are more compatible with planetary boundaries. So I'd really like to hear the panel's thoughts on what a new normal looks like in your context. So Kelly, since you had your hand up already, I will pass the mic to you.
Thank you. Yeah, so I'll try to fold what I was thinking about before into answering that as well. Indeed, so for example, for COMNAP, we used to have a tradition where we would have the executive committee meet alternating hemispheres every year, in addition to our general meetings. But well before this pandemic started looking at, do we need to do that? We've had the basis where we get to know each other in a face-to-face meeting. Can we successfully carry out these meetings virtually? And we proved to ourselves we could. And we were saving the carbon from flying around the planet. It's not necessarily a perfect solution in the sense that, with all of the time zones, there are challenges. But I want to point out a couple of advantages. One is online access opens up opportunities to communities and countries that get limited travel funding. And we are definitely, and this was spoken about earlier, I think Daniela pointed out in her talk, we are definitely seeing economic impacts from our current situation. And so that is the fact that we can work this way. It not only saves our planet, but is going to save our ability to work together, period, in a time of constrained resources. I also want to point out that we have experimented with using real-time translation. And so some other things that have been commented on earlier in SCAR meetings regarding making us more inclusive has been something that has been very effective. And again, I feel like we can use these tools to avoid having to displace people, and we can use them at the same time to enhance inclusivity. So there's some synergies there. And I completely agree with what Hannah said about you have to think through the medium. It's not the same as face-to-face meetings. And I don't think it's ever going to fully replace face-to-face meetings, but it's going to be a very important part of our sustainability going forward.
Thank you, Kelly. And I should read out a comment from Hannah. This also helps people with caring responsibilities to contribute more fully, and that is absolutely true. The ability to participate in meetings from home shouldn't be underestimated. So Gary, I'd like to bring you in here. Last year, SCAR's president proposed that SCAR set a target of achieving net zero carbon by 2030. So would you like to comment on how the current situation might give SCAR the impetus to move towards that goal?
Yeah, thanks, Chandy. Yeah, look, I mean, this is something the pandemic has done for us, is actually caused us to pause and rethink how we do business, how we interact, how SCAR is going to operate. So I think without that pause, it was a much harder journey, but as long as we actually take the pause and don't just rebound back. And Kelly's mentioned a number of things that SCAR is also trying to do here in terms of trying to get as many of its meetings and interactions online as possible while maintaining the opportunity for new people to come in, engage more broadly, etc. So it might be a bit of a mix there. But as SCAR's looking into how we achieve this, look, we recognise that lots of SCAR's activities are high in their carbon footprint, but we're working with Toitu, which is an outfit in New Zealand who helps you audit and manage your carbon footprint. And that's a really important opportunity for us to learn about the fact that, you know, we quickly jump to conclusions. Air travel, it's all about air travel. Actually, the carbon footprint of our actions is actually very broad. And so understanding it and how you might manage it and reduce it's important. Moving your meetings to more optimal places. I know that information has been published recently as well. And looking at how you allow some people to zoom in and others to meet in person, and you just help with the mix of how you include and be inclusive. So we're hopefully going to sign up to Toitu to help us reduce our carbon footprint and meet those targets we've set. And in the meantime, we're continuing to do things at every opportunity to reduce our carbon footprint. So even, you know, the learnings from this meeting are important to us.
Thank you, Gary. Would either of Hannah or Daniela like to comment on that?
Yeah, just to add to that, that idea of travel, we often have this idea too with Antarctica. It's often a question like, have you been there? There's a lot of value placed on fieldwork, not necessarily just for the work that you're doing, but for having had that experience in Antarctica. So I think there's also opportunity now to really appreciate the great amount of work that's done back home, for instance, by our modelers, by a whole range of researchers, really. They're making really important contributions to knowledge, and they don't necessarily have to go to Antarctica to do that. So that's not to say that some work doesn't have to be undertaken on the continent, but maybe having a bit more of an appreciation for the broad range of knowledge making that happens within our community.
Thank you, and we'll hear from Daniela now, because I can see you waving there, and then we'll move on to this long list of other questions that's come in.
Thank you, Shandy. Hannah actually just preempted what I was about to say, saying that as a social scientist, working remotely is very, very important. But another point that builds on what Gary said, that we cannot just think of travel in terms of the carbon footprint. In fact, I mean, Antarctic data and climate data are using IT infrastructure with data centers around the world, which are actually material contributors to carbon emissions by consuming a relatively large amount of electricity. I think there was an estimate of these data centers consuming about 2 to 3% of global electricity. So we need to think about that too. Nonetheless, reducing travel is one way forward. And I echo all of what Kelly said and how that can possibly even help us in providing access to researchers and stakeholders who are not otherwise able to travel. It also allows us much better record keeping of our meetings, seeing that we have a recording function and seeing that a lot of the parts of meetings or presentations that are normally given at conferences are not necessarily being captured. And now we have the ability to capture those and are making use of that and can provide access to those presentations to those that may not be able to travel or may not even be able to join synchronous discussions.
Thank you. And obviously one of the things about travel is that it takes up a lot of time. Time is something that Antarctic stakeholders often don't have. There's an interesting question that's come in about the reliance on volunteers. So obviously volunteers need to put their time into all of our organisations' work. So a question come in, what might the impact of the pandemic be on organisations like APEX and SCAR, who are reliant on volunteers, who have much less time than before? So Hannah, I'd like to pass that to you.
Yeah, it's had a big impact on APEX in terms of what's possible, because when you have organisations that rely on the work of volunteers to make things happen, you do need to appreciate that all these extra stresses in people's lives mean they have less time to dedicate to organisations such as APEX as well. So I think that's something that's really worth considering. And also it's quite uneven as in who does have the time to contribute to. So something that we have to look out for going forward is making sure that we're not just selecting those who sort of had a lot of support at this time and then could sort of leverage that for future opportunities, but making sure that, you know, if we are creating opportunities or fellowships and the like, to be thinking through, you know, if there is a period of time here when early career researchers didn't have a lot of sort of extracurricular things on the CV, there's a really good reason for that as well. So appreciating the time that people put in, but also appreciating that at this point in time, many people can't, they just simply can't.
And Gary, do you have any thoughts on that? Obviously SCAR is very reliant on our many volunteers. This meeting alone is illustration of that. Yes,
that's right. One could argue it's not the time to be vice president of any volunteer organisation, but so I think, yes, I mean the workload on volunteers has increased markedly as we face this. But I think perhaps what we need to try and take out of it is that the reason that the workload is high is because we're not used to this scale of disruption and dealing with disruption, and I think that hopefully the lesson is that SCAR can work on being a little bit more fluid, a little bit more flexible in the way that it operates, so that we don't have quite the reliance on the volunteers having to step up. So totally recognise that in different places people have different challenges, and in SCAR we're trying to hand the baton backwards and forwards to those who can cope with it at the time. And then when others get in a better space, and, you know, we can't predict that given the situation in different countries, but what we can do is learn that, yes, we operate on volunteer basis, but we have to work out how to be more flexible and helpful to those volunteers, because it's for the benefit of the organisation. If people want to volunteer and can, and we can find ways to encourage that, we definitely need to look at it.
Yes, thank you, Gary. And that leads on to the question of how SCAR and COMNAP can provide support to researchers that find themselves in difficult circumstances. And one of the questions that has come in is on what strategies can be adopted to address reduced or absent Antarctic field experience and critical skills that will be faced by early career researchers because of the pandemic. The question is, how can SCAR help? But as SCAR and COMNAP both fund fellowships for researchers, I think it'd be good to hear from both of you. Kelly, would you like to come in first?
I apologize, I just got popped out. So what I'm going to do to make my connection better is turn off my video. And if you want to go with someone else answering first, then I'll figure out what the question was.
Okay, well, Gary, would you like to start? So the question was, that's just disappeared from my screen, but if I remember rightly, the question was about how SCAR can support researchers to compensate for the field experience that they're not getting because of the cancelled field activities in this season and future years.
Yeah, it's a really great question, and I don't have a silver bullet, I'm afraid, but for sure, the SCAR fellowship scheme and the way we're trying to support people, we're definitely looking at how do we turn that to supporting other activities, not just travel to conference and not just field work, etc. So we're looking at that. And also looking at ways that we can encourage early career folks to get more involved in the development of these new scientific research programs. And just to mention, we had a really good session on that a couple of days ago, SCAR's Future Science. But for those who are listening in, please go to the link on the SCAR webpage and drop down under science to program planning groups, and that's where the new programs are developing, and you can see what's being talked about and discussed and what the proposals are and how to just drop an email to the leaders of those programs and get involved. So, and in fact, this, because we can talk about this to a wider audience, we might be a bit more successful than we are in the normal meetings where we're talking to people who are more familiar. So a few different things there, but yes, no silver bullet as yet.
Thank you. And while we're waiting for Kelly to sort out her IT, Daniela, I'd like to ask you if the research that you've just told us about is likely to provide some answers to those questions.
Thank you, Shandy. I mean, we do hope to be able to come up with some solid recommendations, but as Gary just said, there is really no silver bullet. And while I cannot really preempt what we may find, especially in an Antarctic community survey and in the analysis of the data that arises from that, because we clearly haven't done that yet, I would also want to have us consider to what extent there can be a buddying up or joining up of researchers that are going in the field, because clearly we still have people going into the field, with others who might require certain types of data and who cannot access the field because of the reduced capacities that we are currently dealing with. So technology can really bring people these days into the field virtually in some cases. And to what extent can these technologies be utilized in an Antarctic context to actually help those early career researchers, especially who are suffering from not being able to access the field?
Thank you. Kelly, I hope that you're back with us now. Would you like to come in on that, and also particularly on the issue of technology? Have you any comments on the extent to which automation can compensate for not being able to get people into the field?
I think the comments were made astutely by my colleagues here on the panel. I would just simply add that one thing that COMNAP has been pressing on is to change criteria for fellowships. We offer fellowships to students every year. So we're taking a good look at the current circumstances and trying to figure out how we can adjust for them, adjust our criteria, pairing experienced researchers who can help relay the feeling or the situation in the field as they're working on existing data sets, allowing people to bridge the time over which we are enduring these unusual circumstances. Again, that would take a set of IT-assisted interactions, but using our organizations to try and help facilitate establishing those. I think these are things that we can do and should do. And this extends throughout the National Science Foundation, where I work. We are considering that for pretty much every endeavor of science that we have going. So we can continue to look around us to see what others are doing in this regard and learn what we can from that.
Thank you. Hannah, I'd like to bring you in now, but I'm going to throw a question at you to consider alongside this discussion. So we talk a lot about early career researchers gaining skills which are imparted by people late career researchers. But do you think there are skills, or what are the skills that early career researchers have that others could learn from, particularly in these times? Thinking particularly of social media, but I think it's much broader than that.
Yeah, thanks for that question. And I think often people will think first of technology. As I mentioned, Apex has been working remotely for a really long time, but I don't think that's all there is to it, actually. I think what else we can learn from these early career researchers too is many of them are coming to these discussions with quite an open mind and not necessarily being stuck so much in a silo of a discipline. There's a lot of curiosity that we see in our Apex meetings too, people coming from very different areas with a genuine interest in each other's work. And that's also something that I think we could see translated further up as well, or learn from that, how that curiosity can lead to some conversations that shed light on the way we look at Antarctica in a whole lot of really different ways. They've also been incredibly welcoming of some of those perspectives from disciplines that might be new to looking at Antarctica or haven't historically. We've seen some really nice collaborations between sort of biologists and humanities researchers, for instance, as well. And I do think if we are looking at some of these opportunities for maybe mentoring schemes, it can be useful to think a little bit wider too. Also, you know, people who've had experience with gaining funding, looking backwards as well and helping those who are coming through, but just thinking through those networks that you have through all different career levels. And when you're entering into these sort of mentoring relationships too, doing that by thinking, you know, I have something to offer, but I can also learn something as well, whether that is to do with technology and operating in an online environment, or whether it's to do with making connections with people who you may not have thought you had much in common with to begin with.
Thank you. And we are almost approaching the end of our discussion, so I will shortly throw a general question to everyone on the panel. But before that, I wanted to address a specific question to Gary. A great part of the work presented by SCAR to the ATCM Forum is based on long-term monitoring activities. So how is that going to impact SCAR's capacity to advise the ATCM? But before you answer, Gary, the final roundup question, which I'm going to ask everyone to answer, is what aspect of how your community has responded to the current situation gives you hope for the future? I'm going to go through all the panelists and ask for that, but if you would like to give a double response, that would be great.
Thanks, Jenny, and it's a really good question because, and probably not for me. I would want to turn to Alex Terrouds, who looks after the SCAR Standing Committee on the Antarctic Treaty System. So I'm not perhaps the best person in SCAR to answer that, but we're certainly looking at it. What SCAR's keen to do in two respects with respect to the ATCM is see if I know that some programs are allowing access to and collection of those data. Some of it is broadcast remotely, so we're getting it. So we're quite hopeful that through the different programs, the data will not only continue to be collected remotely, but that we might be able to access that data. Now that may not be true in all cases. We may, in some cases, we know we've got instruments that will just keep running over this season. But we also know there's disruption in terms of how the treaty system is meeting. So there are a number of unknowns there that we need to line up first. So we're definitely trying to make sure we continue to gain that data. But also I do want to turn back to this important point that was raised by Valerie Masson-Delmotte in the very first plenary, and that is that actually one of the more important things here is that we get the material we have and the data we have published and out there and peer reviewed, because yes, we know a lot of the trends, and yes, I know that we'll continue to see those trends through the data set and they'll continue to help us with our modelling programs. But actually, let's get the information published so that it gets picked up and acted on and pulled into policy. And it's not just the IPCC, the Antarctic Treaty System rely on seeing things published and peer reviewed as the evidence that they need to make decisions on. Right. So That's the first question. Maybe you can just remind me what your general question was, Chandy.
I'm going to give you time to think about it. My general question is, what makes you hopeful in the past months? What about the way your community has responded makes you hopeful for the future? Gary, I'm going to start with Daniela, and then we'll come back to you.
Thank you, Shandy. And I have already answered in part, at least I hope, this question in my earlier presentation, but just to briefly summarize again, what made me hopeful was to see how the community within SCAR and beyond responded to the challenge that was posed by COVID-19 in relation to our engagement with the Antarctic. It made me hopeful to see that researchers are actively engaging and thinking about this topic, thinking about their own impact and footprint in the world, and thinking about their contribution to society and potential science policy interactions more broadly. It also made me hopeful to see how quickly a community can pull together to look into overarching research questions and galvanize multiple efforts across different disciplines to all focus on a common goal. So in my eyes, the collaborative and collective strength that we have seen in our response within the Antarctic arena is really reason for hope for the future. Thank you.
Thank you. And I'd like to bring in Hannah, but also just to say Gabriella has, who's moderating this session, it's really brought the community of early career researchers together. So I'm sure Hannah would like to add to that. I'm afraid we've only got 2 minutes left to this session. So please go ahead.
In terms of what gives me hope for the future, I think this whole rethinking of inclusivity and ways to facilitate that collaboration is really positive. We also had a panel to do with inclusive collaborations here at this SCAR conference, but just that kindness and that even thinking of and putting on the agenda, you know, people with caring responsibilities, intersectional differences in gender, race, career status, ability. And I think that if we could see this fostered and using this sort of online conference here as a starting point to think what could we learn from this and how could we continue making our communities more inclusive going forward, that would also be a positive thing to come out of here.
Sorry, muted. Kelly, would you like to comment next? I'm not sure. Kelly, are you there? While we're waiting.
Hello, yes.
There we are.
There, sorry. So my answer, since we have such little time, is what Daniela, Hannah, and what Gary will say, no doubt, definitely. And I'm just very heartened by the level of commitment and redoubled commitment under these circumstances by already very committed community. So I think we have a lot of cause for optimism.
Thank you. And Gary?
Yeah, thank you all. I very much agree. I think the SCAR community is really amazing, supportive, and this online session has been just amazing over the last week. But the thing that really gives me hope is this growing realization, not just amongst us in SCAR, because we actually kind of knew this, but more globally, that we have to do things differently. We are not going to solve these global challenges by being in our silos. We have to get together, we have to think differently, and we have to take new approaches, and we have to be open to that, because we won't make it if we don't. And I see that starting to happen and people starting to pay attention, and I think we should encourage that at every move. Thanks, Chandy, and thanks to my fellow panelists.
Thank you. Now it's we are bang on midnight my time when this session was due to end. So I'd like to thank all our panelists for their amazing contributions to tonight's event, and thank you, the audience, for listening. This event will be streamed on YouTube, so you can catch, if you didn't catch all of it, you can have a look later. We are now we're now about to end that. The next session actually starts immediately and is a virtual poster session. So if it's still daytime where you are, I'm sure you might want to check that out. And thank you to all the audience for all your questions. We didn't get through all of them, but we will try and answer as many of them in writing as we can outside of this session. So thank you very much, everyone, and good night or good morning. Or good evening. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. See ya.
Thank you. Bye.